Morning. Today's lesson, we're in chapter 2. We're still in chapter 2 of Luke. And today we get a rare glimpse into Jesus' childhood. Today's lesson, we see him at 12 years old. Now, scholars are not sure where he went to school. They doubt if he went to the synagogue school because there was a synagogue in Nazareth, but the schools were all in Jerusalem. That was just too far to travel for a young person. So at this point, he probably learned from his father, Joseph. He was probably fluent in Aramaic and had a working knowledge of Greek and Hebrew because of its use throughout the area. It's important to know that. He studied the Torah, but because of the rareness of the Torah was, each family didn't have one. There was one at the synagogue, and when you went there, you heard it being read. You couldn't even read it until you were 13. You had to have it read to you. Now, Joseph, Jesus' father, was a carpenter, and it was customary at that time that the oldest son took up the occupation of the father. So, most likely, Jesus was working with his father in carpentry. I think sometimes you see this when you read Jesus' words. He talks about specks of sawdust in your eye, seeming like a beam. He talks about, a foolish man building a foundation on sand and wise one on rock, knowing the differences between structure. And even talking about who is man that he could add 1 cubit to his life. And these terms are those terms used by a person in construction. Even on the way to Calvary, he speaks of the differences between the green wood and the dry wood. And as a carpenter, you'd know such things. So you see evidence throughout his ministry of his training in carpentry. And that's what he was studying for. Now, we pick up the text today. They were on the way to Jerusalem. They always say up to Jerusalem, even though it was south, because Jerusalem's elevation is about 1,800 feet higher than the rest of the area. And he was 12 years old, going to his last Passover feast in Jerusalem, which was a 7-day feast commemorating Passover, which is the feast of celebrating the escape out of Egypt. And also the provision in the forest and the crossing of the Red Sea. All of it was in the celebration of Passover. They called it the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, we make a lot of unleavened. It doesn't have the bacteria, so therefore it's unsin. Quite frankly, as far as the Jews were concerned, it's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread because they had to leave Egypt so fast that they didn't have time for their bread to rise. It was really marking the expediency and the way that they were leaving Israel instantaneously out. There were 3 feasts that all males were required to go to at that time. The Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Those 3 feasts were required if you were a faithful Jew to go to the temple in Jerusalem for every year. And some of these, like the Feast of the Passover, was 7 days long. So you'd get a caravan. All the people would come from the surrounding little villages together. And normally the men would walk together and the women would walk together and the children would run around. And it was a long trip, and they would walk together. And so, as being a 12-year-old, he was a year from being what the Jews consider an adult. At the age of 13, a Jewish boy become a Jewish man, in that he could be counted as one of the 10 men required to start a tabernacle. At that age, he was allowed to read the Torah, not only just have it read to him. That's why sometimes in these ceremonies you see the Jews, when the young man reaches a certain age, they let him read from the Torah, because that's a requirement that you be 13 or over to do that. Let's pick up in the text. We're in chapter 2 and verse 41. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem, after was the custom of the feast. And when they had fulfilled the days, 7 days, as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem. And Joseph, his mother, knew not of it. But they, supposing him to have been in the company, went a day's journey, and they sought him among their kinsfolk acquaintance. And when they found him not, they turned back to Jerusalem, seeking him. So, at this time, the feast is over. They had 7 days, they had a lot to talk about. And how these caravans progressed, all the men would walk together and discuss things, and the women would walk together, and the kids kind of scattered in either group. So when you look at this and say, what kind of parents were they that they didn't see the kid? Because the mother probably thought he was with the dad, and the dad thought he was with the mother. It's easy. It's not like today. Today is a dangerous world out there, and I think that, what we used to do as kids is not allowed today. You can't go out and, my mother would run us out of the house. You weren't allowed to be in the house unless it was time to eat or go to bed. The rest of the time, you get out of the house. Don't be around afoot, she would say. Don't be in here afoot or around me. She has work to do. Get out of here. And so I thought that was interesting. Today's mothers, they're always looking for their children. They got to know exactly where they're at. And I understand that. I really do. I don't act like it sometimes. I remember when I was watching one of my granddaughters when she was about 2 or 3. I wasn't. She was allowed to stay with us, and we were watching her, and I remember the mother called and said, "Where's so-and-so?" And I said, "Well, the last time I saw her, she was down by the lake walking around." Well, my son called me a little while later and said, "Dad, are you trying to never have our grandchildren?" I guess it was a joke too far. But I even remember Henrietta when we went into Spain, and I was gone back to the States, and she was there by herself, and she'd go to the gypsy markets downtown because we lived out on the economy. And one time she had Jimmy, and he was probably 3 or 4, and had him by the hand going through that gypsy market. And of course, they tell you over there, the gypsies would take the Rubios, or the boys with blonde hair, and they'd take them sell them into North Africa. It was just a traffic in children. It was horrible. It was terrifying. And it scared every American wife or mother to death over there. And she went down to the gypsy, and she was looking at something, and evidently for a second she took her hand away from him to buy a chicken or to look at something, and she turned around and he was gone. Of course, she didn't know the language that well. She was running around trying to talk to these Spanish people about, "Have you seen my son?" And they couldn't understand her, and they were trying to do business. And she went through about a 30 or 40 minute period, I'm sure, of terror. And she ran outside the market, and here he was, the La Guardia Civil, which is the police over there in Spain, with the leather hats and the front squashed, and they're very authoritarian police. And he had my son Jim by the hand, and Henry saw him, and she saw his mother about the same time, and they ran tearfully into each other's arms. But she, I'm sure, remembers that with great terror, the terror in your heart of losing a child. I remember my father, we have a hunting camp in West Virginia, and my father had 3 brothers, and one of them was the younger brother, and his, he had 2 boys. And my father, he brought one of them up to the hunt camp one time, and we were hunting. My dad hunts, and he's not one of those people that was really good with children. But his younger brother wanted his son to hunt with my dad because he was known as a great hunter. And Dad said, "Okay, I'll take him." Well, they'd go in the woods 5 o'clock dark in the morning and come home dark at night. And Daddy took the boy with him. And like my dad would sometimes do, he went up a hollow and up another hollow. And he set him down by a rock and said, "You stand there, stay there, I'll come and get you later." And he went on off hunting. I think the boy was probably, 10, 12 years old. And Dad forgot about him. And that night came in, and we were in the cabin. It was dark, and Dad walked in, and his brother went over and said, "Oh, hey, Roy, how'd it go?" And he said, "Well, I saw a couple, but didn't get anything." He said, "Well, where's Tommy?" Dad looked, a little expression on his face, says, "Tommy? Oh, I forgot him. He's back here in the..." I thought I was going to have a heart attack. They jumped in the truck, went up there, flashlights, and sure enough, he's sitting there right by that rock. But Dad was never asked to take any children hunting after that. But I remember that with a chuckle, knowing how people are today. And it was safe. But in this lesson today, don't be too hard on the mother and father. The way they traveled in their culture there, the children had a lot of freedom to run back and forth as long as they stayed in the caravan. So it was not that unusual that they could go a whole day. But that night, when they settle down to camp, the families come back together, and woe and behold, they're missing Jesus. And that's what happened here. And it says here, when they found him not, they turned back to Jerusalem seeking him. So they'd been gone a day. And then there was a day out and a day there, and they searched for him for a day, because it says here, verse 46, and it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. So can you imagine? They go a day out and they go a day back. They search the city for a day, and then finally they find him in the temple when the scholars were sitting there. And here's this 12-year-old boy. It's pretty astounding that they even would tolerate him in their presence. But it says something about Jimmy, listen to me, about Jesus. They found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing him and asking them questions. Not only was he there, he was engaged in the conversation. Always remember, he was all man. He was all 12-year-old, but he was also all God. And so his curiosity, his drive was to be there. Be there, hearing and asking. And when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. And that word sorrowing is pretty interesting. It's a word of sorrow that means great pain. It's the same Greek word that they use in Ephesians when it talks about the elders letting Paul go and tears running down their face, and they know they'll not see him again, or they don't think they'll see him again. And it's great sorrow. And if you're ever, thinking about losing your child, you know what that sorrow is like. I mean, it's a terror that's constantly there. So she said, did you even think how this would affect us? And then Jesus really, and this is the first time he speaks, by the way, in the Gospels, but a lot's in his answer. And he said unto them, How is it that you sought me? Know ye not that I must be about my Father's business? No, don't look at that and say, well, he just blew them off. That's not the case. First off, is that word business is not even in the original text, Greek text. They've added that. The word Father's affairs, it infers I'm doing what my Father would have me to do. It's not a direct translation of the word business. Also, he said, Mom, I love you, but my life from here on out is not about you. Now, there's a great lesson in here for parents. When your children reach a certain point in life, they have to go their way. And our comfort isn't part of that. I've seen children and young people be badgered by their parents to go to school locally or to take some type of training locally just so that they could have them close. You have to let them go. You have to let them go the direction that God would have them to go. And Jesus just reminded his mother here that as I become a man, I'm going to grow into my ministry and go my way from here on out. They really didn't understand that. In verse 50 it says, And they understood not the saying which he spake unto them. Now why wouldn't they understand that? We say, wait a minute, didn't we just study that an angel spoke to Mary, and they watched a miraculous birth. And then they went to the temple, and they heard Simeon and Anna say, "This is the Messiah." Yeah, but that was how long ago? That was 12 years ago. Time has a way of dulling our faith. It shouldn't. That's why Christians sometimes work from one miracle, and then the majesty of that miracle, the awe of salvation tends to diminish when we get further away from it. Time robs us of some of those fascinations, some of that excitement, some of that faith that we had so strong. I've watched Christians that God's worked mightily in their lives later on become dull and faithless. And it's a great tragedy. Great tragedy. They understood not the sayings to them. And so it's important to understand that we have to let them go. I know as a father, sometimes we want to be the great advisors to our sons and our children. But when they leave the home, they are their own authority. My grandson will get married this week, Friday. One of the traditions in our family is we get together on wedding day. The men usually don't do much. The women have 1,000 things to do. But one of the things we started years ago when my boys were getting married is the men who were married would take the prospective groom to breakfast on his wedding day. And each man in turn would go around and give him some advice representing their time married. But one of the things that has to happen is when they get married, they may not know what's coming, they may not be mature, they may not have all the answers, but it's their show, their responsibility. They have the authority as soon as they get married of their family unit. And everyone else may advise. I would say they should hold their advice until asked. When they're in the household, you don't have to ask a father for his advice. He's going to give it to you. But sometimes fathers and mothers become intrusive after marriage. We see them making mistakes or what we think to be making mistakes, and we want to advise them. And I think that young couples need that advice. But if you give it unsolicited, you're going to become someone that gets avoided. That's right. Unsolicited advice from a parent is not appreciated. I just think that you need to wait. And if they have a time of trouble and you handle it properly, they'll come to you and seek advice. But until that time, recognize the authority of that marriage, regardless of how young it is, or how we may think it's ill-advised, or we may even think that they don't know what they're doing, and all those may be true. But when they become a family unit, God ordains them into their own authority. Now, they should have their own responsibility, because with authority comes responsibility. And so that's a good lesson to remember, that they should have understood it. And in the last two texts, and they understood not the saying. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject unto them. He went back in, a 12-year-old. And he went back to work for his father. And we only have one text that covers 18 so years until his ministry opens up. And that's in text, the last final text of the book. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. So everybody says, well, what happens from 12 to when he gets baptized at 30? And the answer is, for his 3-year ministry. And the answer is right there. He went home and grew up a little bit. He became physically stronger, larger, worked hard. He was probably a muscular man, as most carpenters are, or people who work with their hands. I know what he cleaned out that temple, he didn't have any problem throwing those people out. So don't give me this milquetoast Jesus with looks like he's half starved to death picture, because that's not an accurate picture of Jesus. But he increased in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. Wow. So whenever you become a little independent or you start to grow up in your own, we all hope that will be us, that we'll grow up in wisdom. Sometimes it takes time and situations and experiences to learn and become wisdom. But he grew up physically, emotionally, and spiritually for 18 years. And that is the last time we're spoken of Joseph. You'll not hear any more about Joseph anywhere in the Bible. We don't know where it happened to him or died or whatever. This is the last instance when he goes home with Jesus at 12 years old that we hear about Joseph. It's exciting to see Jesus start to open up and start to open his ministry. But this little insight into Christ as a child, the year before that he becomes adult, should give us some insight into, as he left the home, as he started to become a man, how that relationship changed. Well, we're in Florida for the wedding. So God bless you all.